Hey everyone, welcome or welcome back. If you're new here, my name's Nina, and I have struggled with perfectionism for as long as I can remember. Not with everything, but certainly with the things that I care about. It's definitely something that's caused me a lot of anxiety, suffering, and a wide array of negative consequences in my life. I have to admit, however, that I was shocked a few years ago when I started reading studies that showed that perfectionism is actually very common for people with ADHD. In fact, people with ADHD are much more likely to be perfectionists than people without ADHD. And I think this would surprise a lot of people to hear because we don't commonly think of people with ADHD as being perfectionists, because on the surface it can look like we ignore details or that we rush through tasks. And of course, perfectionism is really centered on the exhausting pursuit of always striving for flawlessness. But after giving it some consideration, I realized just how much sense this really makes, even though I had never personally made the connection before reading the research. Because perfectionism is often linked to getting anxious about small details and a desire to prove that we are good enough, which, as we know, are things that people with ADHD do tend to experience. So today I want to go ahead and explain this link and then share some strategies to help us overcome it. But first, what exactly do we mean by perfectionism, and what are the reasons that a connection exists with ADHD? Well, we can describe perfectionism as the tendency to strive for flawlessness and perfection. It is characterized by high standards, self-criticism, and a fear of failure. Perfectionists often set unrealistic goals and are quick to find fault with anything that does not meet their expectations. And on some level, perfectionism can be a positive trait. It can motivate us to achieve amazing things and to produce high quality work. However, much more commonly, it can also be an extremely negative trait, especially when it leads to stress, anxiety, and procrastination, which it definitely did for me. Some signs that we might be struggling with perfectionism can be setting unreasonable or even unattainable standards for yourself, being prone to all or nothing thinking, being highly critical of yourself and your work, not feeling good enough, feeling afraid of failure, procrastinating on or even avoiding tasks because you are afraid of not doing them well enough, being sensitive to negative feedback, feeling easily discouraged, comparing yourself negatively to others, being self-critical, and experiencing shame or guilt when you do not meet your own expectations. At its core, perfectionism really is tied to anxiety. It's all about control, trying to prove our own capability, and trying to avoid the disappointment of other people. And because they share so many characteristics, perfectionism and anxiety can start to create a vicious cycle. Because if we are having anxiety about meeting an expectation, that anxiety is going to lead to further perfectionism, and the cycle goes on and on and on. Now, as I said earlier, studies have shown that there is a strong link between perfectionism and ADHD. That doesn't mean that every single person that has ADHD is going to also struggle with perfectionism, but it is extremely common. So why is this the case? Well, for many of us, it can actually be psychological overcompensation for feelings of inferiority we may have experienced after making ADHD-related errors, or when struggling to try to fit into a neurotypical world. In a sense, we're just desperately trying to override our executive dysfunction. We feel like we have to work harder than people without the disorder in order to be successful. This is sometimes because when we grow up with ADHD, our symptoms like hyperactivity and having difficulty focusing can lead us to experience excessive criticism and even punishment because we find completing tasks more challenging and we are more driven to do things in unconventional ways. This can make us feel like other people can do things better than we can and that we have to make drastic changes in order to be acceptable. We can have a need to be perfect and to prove our worth and our ability to the outside world when we continuously feel like we are judged by others. So it can really become an unhealthy coping mechanism for us where we try to meticulously control every aspect of a task. It can also be extremely frustrating for us because it's no secret that when we have ADHD, we often also struggle with the skills that we need to follow through with tasks. So things like organizing, planning, and time management can be very, very challenging. And this can make it very hard for us to meet the extremely high standards that we set for ourselves, and therefore can lead to procrastination, avoidance, and anxiety. And it can also make it very difficult for us to even enjoy our accomplishments. So now tell me, does this sound familiar? For me, I literally checked every single box, and I actually found it very validating to learn about this connection. The good news is, if we have ADHD and we do struggle with perfectionism, there are many things that we can do to help us overcome it. The first is to identify our perfectionistic tendencies. Ask yourself what your triggers are and what situations and tasks tend to make you feel the most stressed out and anxious about making mistakes. Once we have this information, we can start to address these triggers and to develop healthier coping strategies and to start to put things in perspective instead of letting our mind create all these scary stories and scenarios where we feel like our only hope to avoid suffering is to do something perfectly. The next thing we can do is to challenge our negative thoughts. As perfectionists, we often have incredibly unhealthy and inaccurate thoughts about ourselves and our abilities. And if we want to change our behavior, we have to start by questioning these thoughts and beliefs. So if we find that we're having a negative thought that's resulting in us wanting to run back to our perfectionistic tendencies or causing us to want to procrastinate, we need to stop what we're doing and ask ourselves some helpful questions like, is this thought really true? Is there any evidence to support this thought? What is the worst thing that could happen if I make a mistake? What is a more realistic and positive way to think about this? What is the most helpful thing I could say to myself right now? And what is one small step I can take to move forward? Answering questions like these can help us to put things back in perspective. Now, the third thing we can do is to learn to set realistic goals. When we start to do this, we are much more likely to focus on what we really can achieve with reasonable effort, as opposed to focusing on what we feel we cannot achieve without obsessively trying to execute it 100% flawlessly. This helps to motivate us and to stay on track, and really eliminates the need for perfectionism because we start to focus on simply doing something well without the unhealthy drive to meet unreachable standards. We have to understand that when we set unrealistic goals, we are much more likely to feel stressed out and anxious about actually achieving them. And this can make us want to procrastinate and fill us with self-doubt, which can start the wheel of perfectionism all over again. Now, number 4 is probably the hardest advice to take, but we do need to allow ourselves to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. It is a normal part of life, and if we want to overcome perfectionism, we have to learn to tolerate this and to stop beating ourselves up about them. A mistake does not mean you're a failure or less than other people in any way. We need to simply learn from them and move on. We also need to start celebrating our successes. Now, looking back, this is something that I never did. Ever. But it is so important that we do this even when they seem small, because it helps us to build self-acceptance and self-confidence. So when you do achieve a goal, take the time to appreciate the accomplishment and feel genuinely proud of yourself. Notice everything that you had to do to achieve it, everything you had to overcome in the process, and everything that you learned. Because when we take time to really reflect on our successes, it helps us to appreciate them even more and helps to ensure we're going to have further successes, which is really the goal in the first place. And as a side note, people with ADHD can also greatly benefit from improving their executive functioning skills. These are the skills that help us to plan, organize, focus, and manage our time. And when we can improve upon these skills, it can help us to beat procrastination and also other self-defeating behaviors that really lead into perfectionism. So it's a way of addressing it from the other side. And remember, if this is something that you feel that you are struggling with, you are not alone. Millions of people with ADHD struggle with this. And with self-awareness and through techniques like we learned today, it is absolutely possible to manage it and live a much more fulfilling life. So as always, I truly hope you found today's video to be helpful and insightful. And if you did, please like it, share it, and definitely become a subscriber if you aren't one already. I would absolutely love it if you stayed connected. I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today, and I hope the rest of your day is extraordinary.